Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As many of us approach midlife, it's inevitable that some of us, if not a good portion of us, have experienced loss. It's the loss of a loved one, perhaps even a family member. Whatever that case may be, a loss is something that certainly changes our perspective about life and maybe has us kind of dwell within and figure out where do we go next and what is it going to be like when we go to the other side. On the Beyond 50 radio program today, When Grief Calls Forth the Healing is the title of the book, and joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is its author, Mary Rockefeller Morgan. She's joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today. It's been in private practice since 1991, but interestingly enough, is sharing her loss through this wonderful memoir of a twin brother that she lost many years ago. I'd like to welcome Mary to the Beyond 50 radio program today. Mary, how are you?
Thank you very much. I'm fine, Daniel, and very pleased to be here with you.
Well, thank you. Now, tell us, how this all came about. This is really a fascinating story here, especially when you come from the perspective of a twin. That's really different here.
Well, it's true. I think that one of the reasons, or it's interesting because when I first wrote the book, which came out last year in hardcover and now is coming out in paperback, I really was focused mainly on twins and twin loss, but I got so many letters from people who were not twins, who were touched by some of the issues that I brought up, and I really was able to see and brought that into bearing for the paperback version, that twin loss actually magnifies and illuminates the issues of deep personal loss, and so that there is a connection. I think that one of the amazing things about twins, which is special, is that they begin their connection to each other. They develop this incredible bond, whether they are fraternal or identical. They develop this bond in the womb. And as little embryos, they are actually developing and growing in connection with each other, sharing their mother's blood, actually, which nurtures them, and they actually even share cells that go through their body and their mother's body. So they're really intimately connected from the very beginning, and they develop in a sense of this connection. That makes it very special in terms of when one of them dies, because the issue, I think, that is paramount and also comes up in deep personal loss and really interdependent relationships, that are not twins, is that issue of identity. Mm-hmm. And for twins, it's absolutely huge. The little I is seen in the framework of a we from the very beginning. And so twins are really challenged in terms of the developing of a sense of independence and a sense of an individual self as they grow after they are born. And depending a lot on how they've been brought up by their parents, whether they're just treated as really a one. I mean, I've treated and talked to twins who really have the same, who are called by, their names are coupled, like Brenda Linda, for instance. Instead of one being known as Brenda and the other as Linda, nobody really bothers to tell them apart. But so that there is this issue of the special bond, and that affects tremendously the grieving process, mm-hmm. Which you could imagine. And often twins see themselves as, when one dies, they feel that a half of themselves is gone. And in terms of their identity, they don't really know who they are. Mm-hmm. So this is very powerful in terms of my own experience. And I was in New Guinea. I went with my father. My twin brother, I believe you asked me how it all began in 1961. Mm-hmm. Well, my brother was in New Guinea. He first was on an anthropological expedition in the Baleen Valley in the central part of New Guinea, and he was the sound recording man for an expedition that was making a film called Dead Birds. And then after that finished, he went down to the southern coast to collect art for the Museum of Primitive Art. And he was collecting sculpture from the Asmat peoples who were in this it's the most remote area of the whole world, actually. And it's just a jungle coast where there are no rocks of any kind. It's only mud and water and these mangrove trees that grow out of the water and the mud. And it just stretches for miles and miles. And then there are little tiny villages along the rivers. But these people are extraordinary sculptors, and so Michael was collecting sculpture. He was traveling across a huge delta, much like the Hudson River in New York, a very wide delta, and his boat capsized due to heavy outgoing outgoing current, and then running into a very bad tide with a high moon. And his boat capsized and was swept out to sea. And he and another man and two boys who were acting as translators for local dialects. The two boys were very frightened, and they were local, as I say, Asmat people, Papuans, and they swam, and they were miraculously taken ashore, or able to reach shore, and able to get to a missionary who happened to be not so far away. In 11 hours, they reached him, and he phoned for a plane to come and try to rescue Michael. But Michael and Rene, the other man who was with him, the anthropologist, didn't know about that, and they thought that there was no way they'd ever be rescued because it was so remote and there were no planes or anything or no boats. And so Michael started to swim to shore to try to get help. That's the last time he was ever seen. Mm-hmm. And there have been many stories about how he was killed, and when he did get to shore and he was killed, and there were stories about how he died, but there really is no knowing. We have no evidence of any kind of how he died, no material evidence.
Mary, as a twin, I've heard this over the years about the connection that twins have that really is seemingly psychic. There's a connection no matter what the distance is. One can sort of sense the other. I've even heard stories as one's eating ice cream, the other one tastes vanilla, for instance. Mm-hmm. What was that like for you, especially when it came to your brother disappearing or dying? Was
Yes.
there an experience like that?
Well, we didn't share a common language the way some identical twins do when they first begin their lives together. But I did have a kind of psychic experience in that when he was discussing with my father that he wanted to go to New Guinea, and Father was very interested in art, as was Michael, and he was very excited about Michael going on this trip to collect art for this small museum that my father had started that now is part of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And so they were definitely excited and going to go, and I felt a very deep foreboding about his going, and I tried to discuss it with him and tried to persuade him not to go, and I was very unsuccessful, and it made me extremely frightened. And when a year later, close to a year later, when he was lost, I remember the first thing I felt when Father had received this telegram from the Dutch government, and it just struck me deep inside me, this knowing that he was gone. Mm. I didn't feel any particular knowing at a time where he might have died, and of course we don't know. He disappeared and was never found. But I did, when Father told me, I absolutely knew he was gone. Mm-hmm. And yet I denied that. I moved into a place of denial very shortly after that. And for years I denied his death. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things that I think is so sad, is that there is the thing that's so wonderful, Daniel, is that we have a natural healing process within us that is activated much like if we cut ourselves, and we know that there's a physical system that goes into place to heal the wound once we cut ourselves. We're all aware of that, but we're not aware, many people are not aware that we have that same natural healing process. I call it a healing imperative because it really wants us to heal. And I renamed the book When Grief Calls Forth the Healing, because I felt so strongly that and I know that it is the grieving that actually brings the healing, and that is the natural process. But that doesn't come right away. First, there's the numbness. And I felt in New Guinea when I was there that this just numbness, as it became more and more clear, and I looked down from the plane and saw this terrible, just stretch of trees and water, and no clear, line of demarcation between the water and the land, and mud flats going for miles, and this water rolling in. I just thought, how could Michael ever how could we ever find him? And then the numbness just came at that point, which was really, I believe that my psyche knew that I couldn't take in the horror of this, and that it was helping me by making it so I couldn't feel anything. Mm-hmm. But when I got home, after we finally called off the search, having not found him, my mother met me, and I was so happy to see her, and I remember being, completely feeling like she would somehow take care of me, and I was ready to cry, and I just started to cry when she hugged me, and she sort of stretched her arms out, and she said, "Mary, the one thing you have to understand is that we cannot cry." She said, "We have to pull ourselves together in order to deal with this, and we cannot cry." Mm-hmm. And I mean, that aborted the natural healing process right there. That was one of the and she did that out of love. Mm-hmm. And,
I was going to touch on that, Mary. That's fascinating that you bring that up, because there's a consistency with how others who aren't really going through the grieving process, or perhaps approaching it differently, is how they have these meaning well ways of consoling us through something like this, but yet sometimes that can be one of the biggest problems through this process, because I noticed here that you were talking in your book about how you work with people who were survivors of twin loss with the 9/11 situation.
Yes.
Now, here's, to me, it's kind of a wild story to see this and hear what you just said, because it would be a few years later that I would actually do a segment about some partners who wrote a book about the grieving process. It's called the Grief Hand Loss Book or something like that. I don't, but very, very familiar work. Anyway, so there was a woman that I was working with, and a boyfriend had broke up with her, and she was really feeling down in the dumps at work. So I was sitting there and I was talking with her, and we were out on the patio, and I said, well, sometimes if you want to help with a better perspective, I said, just realize that in the world there are worse things happening than this. Please forgive me, that's my mistake. But again, meaning well. Mm-hmm. The very next day is when 9/11 happens. And she came at me and she says, boy, I guess you're right. And I said, well, I didn't mean to be right like that. But what I also took away was her opportunity to have this experience, as you said, in a natural way. And this happens so often, as you describe, even with the work of Carl Jung, that even in our society, that we have this deep fear of not only death, but grief itself, as though we're just not supposed to do that. Big girls don't cry, men don't cry,
yeah.
This bunch of nonsense that really gets in there and actually could cause a trauma that could be much greater than the loss itself.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up this whole issue of fear of grief, because I think that's one of the major problems that we have in our society in relationship to healing from deep personal loss, whether it be twin loss or any other important relationship. And especially the twins have this problem, which is one of the reasons I think it illuminates other kinds of loss. And that is that the idea that if we allow ourselves to grieve the person who has died, that in doing that, we are letting go our precious relationship to them and their love and our love for them. That we are literally being asked and we are feeling that we have to let that go. And on top of that, that not only are we being forced to let go this precious relationship in grieving, but we're also, the twins feel this very strongly, but we're also abandoning the one that we love by doing that, by letting them go. And I think this is one of the biggest misunderstandings that there is about the grieving process. Mm-hmm. Because in truth, in grieving, and it's the grieving that brings forth the healing, I feel that so importantly. In grieving, we are actually acknowledging and letting go the physical connection that is already gone. Mm-hmm. Our bodies and our minds are not able to take in what is reality out there in front of us. It's slow. It has to be acknowledged and taken in and absorbed in a slow manner, and that's what the grieving does. And it is actually not letting go of the relationship, but it's letting go of the physical connection that has already left us. And in this process of grieving, and I want to talk about that in the kind of grieving in a second, but in this process we are actually honoring our twin or our loved one, and we're bearing witness to their lives. And I think that's the most respectful thing you can possibly do for somebody that you've deeply loved, mm-hmm. is to honor and respect their life. Because the grieving is manifested through memories. And those are the little memories that come through a smell or a tune or somebody says something or whatever, and then up comes the memory, and that memory is filled with grief and filled with terrible loss. And we don't want to be afraid of it. It's not easy. It's not easy, but we don't have to have the fear on top of it, because it is actually the healing process. And slowly, Daniel, that relationship is transforming. It's transforming from the physical connection that is no longer there to what is going to be present for us for the rest of our lives in our hearts, which is the whole relationship that was born of the many, many precious moments that we spent with that person. Mm-hmm. That's not leaving. That belongs to us forever, as well as the love we feel and the love that they felt for us. That's the big misunderstanding, in my opinion, mm-hmm. of what people feel, because they don't understand that they're transforming. Grieving is transforming. It is not giving up. Mm-hmm. Do you see what I mean?
Well, I do, and often I think sometimes when people have a tremendous loss, you tend to hear stories of people who just sort of check out of society. You know, they're done, and it's like the world around them, the people feel this sense of being put on hold or abandoned altogether, and there's a sense of frustration about that because they feel that there's nothing they can really do, you know, and I'm sure that you've had people that you have worked with like this. What has that been like?
Well, I think that what happens so often to so many people, one is our society does not make a path or a safe place for grieving. Mm-hmm. You know, you really have to forge yourself to try to find that. And I'm not saying there aren't organizations like Hospice and Compassionate Friends and for twins, the Twinless Twin Support Group International, which is just a wonderful organization. But in the overall society, we are asked to get up and move on with our lives. And I think those are two really, really bad phrases. What we're really doing is asking ourselves to move forward with our healing, move forward with this process that we're talking about. Daniel, go back for a second for me, because I got kind of thinking ahead, and I want to tie in what I was saying to what you just asked. Can you say it again?
Yes, it was about a person who experiences a tremendous loss, and they sort of check out.
They check out, okay.
And the people who are surrounding them, who are really trying to be there through this process, whether it's friends or family, feel a sense of frustration, because I think there's a sense they feel abandoned or, just sort of let go, so to speak. And that's what I was talking about. And it isn't to displace that at all, but there is that.
There is very much that, and then that's that place of isolation.
Right.
And the place of disconnection. The people become isolated in themselves with their feelings, and especially as everybody else is moving on and they haven't really maybe even started and with their healing. That's very typical of twins. Mm-hmm. And then they become disconnected from their lives and from the people around them. And you see, I think this happens because we don't understand the grieving process, and we don't give it enough time or a safe place to happen. And people, when these feelings, these natural feelings from the natural healing process come up, they need to be expressed in some form. And this is an active process. And the grieving person in our society today has to really claim that time for themselves, either to go into therapy and to find somebody who or a grieving group, but there's bereavement counseling, or they can go into a bereavement group, and you can find those in hospice, as I was saying, and compassionate friends, or be in a group, try to find a group of like people, like the twins. That was so blessed about the twins from the Trade Center, is getting them together, and they just healed. I mean, you could just watch them healing in front of you by being connected to somebody who understood them and who was willing to really be there and listen. Nobody can fix somebody else when there's a terrible death. You can't fix it. You can't be a doctor and fix the wound. It has to slowly heal itself. Mm-hmm. But the person who's grieving has to be willing to partner with those emotions and express them when they come up. And, there are wonderful things I heard on the television just the other night. There was a wonderful group of young people from various ghetto areas in our New York State, where I come from, and they had joined a group where they were writing poetry. And these were kids who had all kinds of losses. They were kids who didn't know how to express themselves, kids just generally coming out of traumatic situations. And the writing of poetry, it wasn't like you had to know how to be a poet, but they put down their feelings. Mm-hmm. In a way that, and then they read them to each other, and they actually, it's grown so that it's now become, some of these poems are being published. But I heard these young people talking about how it had opened them up and taken them out of this place that you're talking about of disconnection, because the families, they need to be really present for that person, but we all know that life goes on. And we need to make more safe places for people to go so that they can have time to express themselves. My husband, for instance, says that the way he grieved his brother, he lost a brother actually to drowning, which was very interesting because we both feel most probably that our loved one drowned. But this boy drowned right next to him, and it was a very huge thing, and he was in college. And he said the only way he could grieve was to run. Mm-hmm. And in the running process, he was able to confront his feelings and to express them through his body. Other people do that in dance. Some people do that in a journal. Some people, as we've said, do it through talking with each other, but we heal in connection. We do not heal in isolation. Mm-hmm. And we get stuck, when we isolate.
I think, Mary, what's fascinating about this story is this, and it was something I hadn't brought up in the introduction, but in your book, When Grief Calls Forth the Healing, is that you come from the Rockefeller family,
Yes.
okay? And I was sort of tempted to bring that up in the beginning, but I thought, maybe I'll get listeners out there. Rockefellers, okay, this is the wealth industrialist people you're talking about. Yes, certainly, that's what we're talking about. Your father's the governor of New York, so you take a look at all this privilege, and people would think, well, wait a minute, why should I listen to this story? They're insulated from problems, and I think when it comes to something like wealth and privilege, people tend to perhaps have a belief that they're insulated from the pain and suffering around them in the world. And an interesting story was Shania Twain, when talking with her about her autobiography, is she went through the loss of her husband, who had actually left for another woman, but that's still painful, And boy, the way she expresses what she was going through in her autobiography was amazing for anybody who had ever suffered a heartbreak. I mean, it was very real, and she talks about that very thing, is that people tend to think that when you're wealthy, that you're insulated from all this pain and suffering that everybody else seemingly feels, but it's no different. We're all human, and that's what makes us so similar, even though we may grieve differently. But I found that fascinating for her to say that, because I knew that was so true, that sometimes, especially in America with media, that we play up and dramatize a person's loss, and I think people who are in the limelight, so to speak, take harsher beatings, in a situation like this, because all of a sudden now they're under a magnifying glass. What would you think about people like that? I mean, that's got to be very difficult.
Well, I think the interesting thing about what you're saying is, first of all, it's so totally true. We're all human beings, no matter what cards that we were dealt in our life. And if we love, we're going to grieve and have loss. There's just and we all are drawn into connections and have that as part of our natural being. But it's interesting that I found the experience Father was not only governor, but he was a contender for the presidency at that time. So he was very much in the limelight. And I found the experience of all the press that were there along the journey, and in this town called Merauke, which was where we stayed, which was before you took a plane or a boat to get to the Asmat area. And I found it extremely isolating and upsetting and out of relationship. I was completely out of relationship with all of those people. And I want to tell a little story about what I think illustrates what you're talking about. We took a seaplane, and we went along a river in the seaplane and landed on the river next to a tiny village called Amamangai. And Michael had been there on one of his collecting trips, and there were some beautiful sculptures there. And so we went, there had been a gasoline can that looked like one of the gasoline cans that Michael had used as a water wing, and in that area. So we wanted to comb that area, and we landed there at the dock, and we're talking to the people through some interpreters, and I lagged behind. Father went forward when we got to the dock, and I turned, and because I was watching these incredible men in these canoes, just beautiful, beautiful people that were paddling these canoes in the most synchronistic way. It was just extraordinary to see. And I turned to follow my father, and in front of me was this tiny lady, and she was an Asmat woman, and they wore no clothes, these people. And she was standing there. She must have been in her late 80s, something like that. Little tiny woman. And here was a woman who was absolutely separated from me by the most enormous culture barrier you've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she couldn't have been more separated from me. Forget being wealthy or not wealthy or having high status or whatever, high exposure in this country. This was a real separation, right? And she turned to me and she held out her hands and took my hands in her two hands and looked into my eyes, and she started to cry.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm telling you, it was the most, I write about this in the book, and it was, I think it was probably one of the most important experiences I've ever had in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And it connected me out of all that feeling of isolation. Here was somebody who understood exactly how I felt. And she didn't need to say one word. She just held my hands and looked at me in the dearest, sweetest, kindest way. And Daniel, I just think that answers it.
Mm-hmm. And there it is when it comes to that is sometimes people offer, it's almost like an instinct, words of consolation, sort of like I did with this friend of mine many years ago. And in retrospect, I wished I could go back and ask for her forgiveness. But, you think you're meaning well, Where we even learn these habits or these behaviors from, when you just summed it up so perfectly, sometimes it's just really a matter of somebody just being present for someone else.
That's
Don't
exactly
say nothing,
the word.
Don't do nothing. Be like a dog. Just be there at their feet if you need to be. And it helps so much more, versus what I did, which could turn it a different direction to where they begin to think, well, maybe my loss just is very insignificant, and it isn't. It's a loss.
Well, you are so sensitive to be able to, to talk about that. I think it's so meaningful to everybody because we've all done that, and
Right.
We all feel so desperately if we love somebody that we want to fix it for them. But I think that word being present is a beautiful word, and the word being present just means, as you said, being present for the person, and not worrying about having to say something so much. I mean, you can just say, I'm so sorry for your loss, and I just would like to be with you, and you can also say, is there anything that I might do, right now for you? Could I be there for you in some special way that might be helpful? Mm-hmm. That's all. And sometimes you just sit, if somebody's in there, and just to sit with them. Mm-hmm. And try to, it's interesting. So when I first worked with some of these twins, especially the younger ones, they wouldn't, they had nothing to say. They just sat there. And one of the things, I would sit with them, and then sometimes what helped me was I would ask them if there was anything that they would like to share with me about their twin. Mm-hmm. That's something, and I, as a therapist, you don't really share your own personal life because your work with somebody else is not about your life, it's about their life and being present for their life. But it was important for me to move to a place where I was comfortable with sharing the place where I could tell them that I was a twin who had lost their twin. That meant an enormous difference to them. Mm-hmm. And, there are mothers who have lost children. I mean, just you're saying to me on the phone, on our interview rather, that you hear that you're telling me that you've lost people in your life. That gives me a whole connection to you. Mm-hmm. And I think for a therapist and for somebody is just saying, for me anyway, for twins, it's so interesting because twins just believe that no other person can understand what their loss is. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was very important to be able to say, your loss is unique. Nobody can ever know what it's like for you, but I can share with you that I lost a twin. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, that dual place where you want to respect the uniqueness, as you were just saying. It doesn't matter whether it's the 9/11 Trade Center, which is a huge disaster, versus somebody losing the love of their life and that person leaving them, whatever the heartbreak is. That those can't be compared, those losses, but they're unique. So I guess there's that unique thing, but also that other place. Because that lady, by crying, by her tears, I knew that she had lost somebody, and she knew how I felt.
Right. Mary, I wonder, because this, was such a big, incredible loss for you, that as you moved through the healing process, and let's just say came to the other side, how did that change, if it did, your perspective on life and the world? Do you have that fear anymore?
I have less fear of death. It's interesting. I think that what was enormously helpful to me was the time that I spent in nature, Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
And in nature, because I took a camping expedition, which was really an organized thing, and I went and spent actually 4 days by myself in quite a remote area in New Mexico, up in the mountains, and I was able to spend that time just being close to nature, and I was able to see how life and death and life express themselves in nature, so that you're constantly in this cycle. And I feel somehow that that I'm connected to a larger place, and that that in understanding that that when you see the natural flora and fauna in front of you, like there was a beautiful grove of birch trees, and they had fallen, a couple of them down, and their lovely silver bark had fallen off, and the inside of the tree had rotted and actually turned into this beautiful earth substance. We call it loam, and out of that was coming all these tiny little birch trees, beautiful little flowers, and other little pine trees that were growing nearby, and moss and toadstools and all kinds of incredible things coming out of this actual being of the tree that had let go its life and was now becoming the generator of new life. And that it seems like a silly thing in a way, but
no, it's a wonderful thing, because you see life becoming impermanent and permanent all at the same time.
Yeah, it becomes kind of like a cycle. And I feel that, and the other thing that you bring up with that question is that when that relationship transforms, when you let go the physical connection, and the relationship transforms so that it can live on in your heart, what I really feel is Michael's presence. And I write about that in the book, and how he has affected my life as I live it today. And I really feel that it's not a memory. I feel him in the background. I feel him in the background of myself. And I feel that not only is he in the background of myself with his amusing way of he was very funny person. Mm-hmm. He teased me all the time, and he was very adventuresome in his spirit, and he's helped me to become much more adventuresome in my spirit. And but he I'm able to see life in this larger context, and I'm also able to feel that love and a very deep love experience does not keep you from other love experiences. It actually can nourish another experience. Mm-hmm. And I had to learn that, because one of the problems that twins have is they keep looking for their twinship in other relationships. Mm. And, they can't find it, because the intimacy of twins, that immediate understanding, that immediate knowing of what the other person's thinking and doing and wanting, and understanding of them in any guise, is just not going to be found in another relationship. And what I found is I met my husband, I've been married to now for 23, almost 24 years. He's a very independent guy, and he has a wonderful life, and I have a wonderful life. And when we first started out, I expected him to be my twin. And I couldn't understand why he wasn't sharing the way I wanted to share. Now, this is sort of female-male, too, but I'm sure you've heard this before. But
you
also,
demanding Rockefellers, you.
yeah, well, no, he didn't think of it in that context, but he just was pushed in a way that was not comfortable for him.
Right.
So slowly I learned how to find intimacy that was not twin intimacy. Do you see what I mean? Another kind of intimacy and a beautiful relationship. That was a long growing experience for me. And that it was able to happen after I had done my healing, it still was a difficult thing for me. But I believe that my love for Michael and the love experiences I've had in my life with my children and whatever, they all multiply so that the loves that I have now are made possible by those experiences.
I always find this is such a fascinating topic to bring on the program, especially from the perspectives that we try to, because, maybe one way doesn't really reach a certain group of listeners, so you try another approach that just might. But in the end, it's about arriving at the same place, that while we breathe in and out, while we rise to the sunrise in the morning, as terrible as a loss is, there's also getting on and taking one step after the next, and living again and not being dead. It's you see in some relationships where, let's say, someone passes, and then the person who has experienced that loss, you might as well have just buried them along with it, because they just sort of let their life go. And I was sharing with a friend of mine many years ago who was feeling, as she said, suicidal. And I said, well, that's a pretty extreme way of thinking, and I can't remember what it was that she was feeling that way. And I said, do you realize that you're about to consider something that you take away a lot of opportunity from other people? And it kind of confused her for a minute, what I was saying. And I said, because you're going through this tremendous pain, and you're experiencing what you're experiencing, there are other people just like you out there who need you. Maybe not right now, but they're going to need you. And if you decide to take this step, which I knew she wasn't, it was just a feeling she was having, but to let yourself go, to off yourself, commit suicide, you deny them of the opportunity to be able to work through this and become inspiring to others. And she got mad at me at first. She says, how dare you, because she understood what I was saying, had a level of truth to it, and realized, my responsibility is to step through this, however, whatever it takes, and that perhaps you help someone else very much do the same. And that's a lot of what your book is about, is just that, is that we're all out there, we're all in this together, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
Well, it's interesting as I listen to you and I keep thinking about the word meaning, which is that place where life has to have meaning, and you have to find meaning again in your life. And I think that part of this whole issue that twin loss brings up is the issue of identity, that one can get so strongly connected to a role and a relationship, that actually that precipitates that role, that when that leaves, one has no sense of meaning in one's life at all. And that this business, which connects with identity, I know for twins, they have to start listening from the very beginning. They have to start listening to themselves. And when somebody brings up something, well, do you like something? Twins are often... They don't even know how to take in an experience, Daniel, until they've talked to the other twin. It's quite amazing. They actually understand the experience in sharing it with the other twin. Are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, funny. It made a funny crackling noise. Anyway, that when one of them dies, they don't have that anymore. So they don't know how to know where they begin and where they end. And they have to start really listening to the smallest kind of thing. Do I like what I'm eating? You know what I mean? How do I feel about what that person is saying? What do I think about this? And that it becomes, in my therapeutic work that I do with bereavement, that developing a sense of who am I is the kind of groundwork that can then, along with the letting go of the physical connection of the other person, becomes the place where one can then develop the growing of a new meaning, so that one can then want to make new connection with life.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, obviously I don't know totally about this woman, and so there's so many different reasons for people wanting to commit suicide. But I know that basically it's, you know, a permanent solution when nothing that's here in your life right now is providing that solution, and it's very tragic when people get to that place.
Mm-hmm. Well, she never did it, and I knew she never would.
That's good.
She wasn't like that. It was just, I think we all could tend to feel that way.
Maybe you helped her with what you said. Maybe you really, you know, brought a little light into her life at a moment where she could take that in.
Mm-hmm. You know, and but I think a lot of us sometimes feel that way in tremendous grief, you know, is that we feel like, you know, it would just be easier, you know,
yes.
to do something like that. And I think we all actually inherently feel that. Very few of us, fortunately, ever act out on this. But, you know, you take a look at what you take away from the world and realize, you know, you're taking away the light of who you are. And that, you know, is to also help others to do the same. And that's certainly, you know, what your book is about. Now, it's interesting what you brought up earlier, because you said that you feel as though your brother is around you and sometimes guiding you in that sort of way. Is that sort of a correct way of looking at it?
Yeah, I just feel that he's kind of in the background.
Right, and the reason that's interesting is that we actually about a year ago, I had an interview with a book. It was called The Afterlife of Billy Fingers. And we posted that up on our YouTube channel for those who are interested. It's 50 Beyond. Look up The Afterlife of Billy Fingers. Now, here was a woman on the East Coast whose brother, you know, he died tragically, just mainly, you know, drugs and this and that over the years, and he died in his 60s. But he came in the afterlife and began talking with her and doing very much the same thing in some ways. And so it becomes a very interesting metaphysical story, because she didn't believe in any of that stuff. But there were just these clear details of things that were happening that it was undeniable that her brother from the other side was really communicating with her, and became a very entertaining book, actually, to say the least. But I find that interesting that you hear that from people, that when they have a loss, whether it's a loved one, in your case it's your brother, is that there's a sense they're still around, like the energy of who they are is still around. What has that been like with other people that you have sat with? Do they experience the same thing?
Well, you know, I want to say, I just want to clarify in this. I don't have a sense that Michael is, I think it's bigger. People always have this way of expressing things. They're either the spirit's still hanging around,
right.
You know what I mean? So they're in relationship, or they've left. For me, I think that's our minds. We have a mind that's only as big as our earth body, you know what I mean? We're here on the earth. We're earth beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have a mind just like we have a body, and it only can do so much. But I have a feeling that the knowing of the world, the knowing of the great oneness, is a great mystery that is so much bigger than us, that we don't really, we're making a demarcation right there when we say somebody's spirit is either there or gone. I don't have a sense that Michael is, I have a sense that Michael is there for me, but I also have a feeling that he's gone on, his soul and his spirit is going on to I don't know what, but that he's free to be growing and developing in his own way. And I feel like his life on this planet, I've come to feel that, and you could say that's wishful thinking, but he was such a kind of old soul when he was with us in our family. He never was involved in any of the kind of stuff of, struggling and fighting among the siblings and, and all what goes on in typical families. He wasn't really a part of any of that, and he had a great sense of humor, and he seemed to have kind of been bigger than that. Mm-hmm. He had a very short life. He died at 22, and at 20 he was just 23 actually, and so I feel like he's present for me, but that doesn't mean his soul or his spirit or whatever it is out that happens to us isn't much bigger than that, and he can't be just like the wind. He can be in all different places. Mm-hmm. If you see what I'm saying.
It really poses an interesting question when you have this experience, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and I think that among Hispanic people, they're different. I remember when I was in graduate school, and they were saying, when they talked about death, they were saying, well, you have to be very careful what you consider to be things that are true and quote normal and what's abnormal. Mm-hmm. And because in mental health, just like in all health, they try to put everything in boxes so we can know how to treat it and know how to take care of it and make it better. Things aren't usually in boxes. And but they, there have been a lot, I think, and please forgive me, anybody who's Hispanic who's listening, I think it's something like espiritos or something like that, but I have come into relationship with people who have seen their loved one after they have died, and they feel that the spirit of their loved one has been present for them, actually felt them present. Mm-hmm. And that is a more common experience among Latin countries than that is in our United States, for instance. And so that had, you could say that might have some cultural implication. Well, maybe people are more open. You don't really know what the answer is to that, but my take on it is always to be open to what the person is saying and not to be filled with judgment about what is actually happening. Mm-hmm. Because when you get into those metaphysical things, I don't think we have the answers.
Well, that's what I mean, is this is an experience that takes us into a realm of wondering, and life is that way anyway.
Yes. Yeah, life is really that way. Absolutely. That's so good, Daniel. It's so true. Well, I think that the most important thing that I want to have happen with this book is the whole idea of breaking people reading the book and having that sense of isolation broken that pervades one in deep personal loss, and to be able to touch the places where people become disconnected from themselves and twins from their sense of themselves, their whole identity of themselves, and to open up the subject of death and grieving as we've been doing together here, and have people really trust that we have a natural healing process, that if we connect to that, and if we stand for that in ourselves and trust our feelings and express our feelings in some form, that we will go through this and we will come out the other side, being able to be in relationship to the one we love without crippling pain. Mm-hmm. And having that be a positive and nurturing thing for us to hold in our hearts the rest of our lives, despite the loss, which mm-hmm. is obviously great.
Now, Mary, for our listeners, is there a website people can find out more about this?
Yeah, www.whengriefcallsforththehealing.
Okay, whengriefcallsforththehealing.com.
.com, yeah.
Which is,
that's
incidentally, the title of the book.
That's the title of the book, and I called it that because I do believe it is the grief that calls forth the healing, and we shouldn't be afraid of that.
I agree. Mary, thank you so much for taking the time to be here on the program today. This is always a fascinating subject, always.
Well, Daniel, you really have made it so also with your questions. I do appreciate having had the time and being able to take the time to be with you.
Thank you again, Mary, for joining us here on the program today.
Okay.
Again, the book is When Grief Calls Forth the Healing, which is also the website as well. You can find out more about that. We'll also have a hot link on our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Be sure to visit us there. We also have our weekly updates that we encourage you to sign up for as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.